Welcome back to It's Not a Sport.
Alright, welcome back. This week we have a great show. I talk about the problems with rank climbing and how it stresses on you mentally and why the incentives to climb aren't good enough. We also talk about the story of video games and just how much it impacts our view as an audience. In the esports scene of Overwatch, they're currently on break, and All Stars begins August 25th. It lasts 2 days. It's August 25th and August 26th, and it's supposedly having a lot of wacky game modes: Lucio Ball, Mystery Heroes, Widow 1v1, Talent Takedown, and Lockout Eliminations. Should be a fun little event if you're an Overwatch fan to see the pros just goof off and have fun and enjoy themselves in the off season. In the NALCS, currently the standings are Team Liquid's in first, 100 Thieves is in second, Echo Fox is in third, also tied with FlyQuest and Cloud9 for third. TSM, Optic Gaming are sixth place, Clutch and Counter Logic Clutch is eighth, Counter Logic and Golden Guardians are ninth. Next week I believe should be playoffs, and then we'll decide who will go to Worlds. In EU LCS, the standings are Fnatic's first, and then FC, Misfits, G2 are all tied for second, Vitality's fifth, Splice is sixth, Rocat seventh, Unicorns of Love is eighth, with Giants also eighth, and H2K is 10th. I hope you enjoy this week's. Make sure to follow the stream. I'm streaming now on Facebook. Links in the description. We're also on Google Play and SoundCloud as well. So make sure to like, subscribe. Greatly appreciate it. Let's move on. Alright, welcome back. So I want to talk about why the casual gamer gaming competitively and, let's say, ranked is kind of a problem, and why it's kind of a scam at the end of the day. The first problem with this is that the player puts in so much work for so little effort, and this can be seen with primarily the two biggest examples in the esports scene is Overwatch and League, and CSGO, but CSGO is a kind of a different topic. So with Overwatch, for instance, you play rank, you climb the ladder, or you don't climb the ladder, and depending on your rank, you get these points, which then you buy golden guns. With League, also very similar. You climb the ladder, or you don't, and depending on what rank you are, you either get a skin or you get a ward and a banner. The problem with these is that climbing is a lot of work. It's a lot of work physically, it's a lot of work mentally, and it's very, very time consuming. I've been climbing, in Overwatch recently, and it's just back and forth, which is the way it's supposed to be, yes, but it's also supposed to be proving, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what rank I am or how far I get, because I just get these points that eventually every season, if I just play my 10 placement games every season, eventually I'll get enough points to get the golden gun. So the grind is just really heavy, and that's the problem with a lot of these games, is that the incentives, which is what we work on, is just not compensate for the grind. And at the end of the day, we really only climb for bragging rights, or that's really it, it's just bragging rights. Because you're not getting better, and it's just bragging rights. That's it. And it just has such a heavy toll on the player mentally. Um, and it changes drastically when you go into, if you get drafted to a team, then the whole mental stage really changes. Uh, a lot of people get burnt out because it's just the grind and the grind and the grind, and it's just grinding even more once you play it on a professional level. And by that point, the game stops becoming what it should be at the end of the day, which is fun. It's the same with League, is that you're grinding and grinding and grinding, you're playing it competitively, and the more stress you take on for these bullshit incentives, the more less the game becomes fun. This is why systems like, for instance, CSGO, I think are the best, you know, competitive gaming system. One, the rank system and the actual system of how the ladder works, how you climb, how you get ranked, how you get placed, is arguably the best I've ever experienced with CSGO. It is really based on individual skill and not other people's skill. I never found it during my times when I was playing CS:GO, and this was years ago. I never found it difficult or mentally straining like I find League and Overwatch to climb, and I always felt like I was climbing instead of dropping and losing and feel like I was getting better or getting worse. So there's no mental drop off, because if I lose a couple games, it's like, okay, I lost a couple games, but I know the game wants me to improve. I know I belong at that level, so the game helps me improve. The game helps me get back to where I am and helps me improve on where I want to be. League and Overwatch aren't like this. League is a different concept. Again, if you listen to our previous episodes, the concept of free to play, they have to keep you playing because you want money. So that system is completely rigged. CSGO also is less team oriented than the two, but it's not hard to implement a system where it's based on your individual skill, which I think League is trying to do with the new rank changes which are coming on, where it's going to be like 5 ranks based on what role you do best. Um, but the mental strain is so hard, and with CSGO, all you get is a rank. You don't get skins, you don't get any real rewards at the end of the day. It doesn't change anything. Uh, it's just, again, purely climbing in the ranks for the pure fun of it. And that's what it should be at the end of the day. It's just, you should be climbing and you should be enjoying yourself, and you should see the results and you should see yourself improve instead of being torn down by whatever, the system is making you torn down. Moving on to the main topic of this week's podcast. In previous episodes, we talked about the art of video games. We talked about the music of video games. I want to talk about the story. For me, there are 2 types of stories. There's this the most casual story, where you're attached to a character or you're interested in a character, or it's just really well told and you have it's relatable in some sort of way. Whether you enjoy the character, whether you want to know what's happened next, curiosity, it's relatable. And that's the most common type of storytelling. The second type of storytelling is just pure curiosity. Is that you want to know, everything's just wacky, nothing makes sense, and you just want to know, what's going to happen next, instead of being attached to a single character or a single plot line. You just want to know what's happened next. The biggest example I can give for this type of storytelling is the Metal Gear games with Kojima. I think is a master of this type of storytelling. Metal Gear Solid 5 was my first Metal Gear, and when I played it, I didn't know what the hell was going on. I didn't know what the fuck was going on, it's a crazy-ass game. But I fell in love, and because of that, I never got the chance, but I wanted to go explore the other Metal Gears. I wanted to go learn about the other Metal Gears. So I searched on the wiki, and I learned that there's Solid Snake, Venom Snake, uh, Big Boss, and all the different characters, and how all the different storylines and what's canon, what's not canon, what goes together. And those are the two most common and most frequent types of storytelling. Storytelling is, if not, again, the biggest aspect of a game. If a game doesn't have a good story, it's arguably not worth playing. Even if the story is vaguely told through some sort of way, uh, it's still not worth playing. Destiny 2 and Destiny, especially the primary Destiny, the story was awful, and you had no idea what was going on. However, if you read the Grimoire cards, which a lot of people did, that grew the experience on how well those stories were written and how well the world was developed through the Grimoire cards. And that's a way of storytelling. It's same with Dark Souls, for instance. Dark Souls stories is told through the items, actually. If you look at the description of the items, it tells you a lot about the lore of the items and the lore of the world. And that's a good way of telling story. Story games, for instance, have been, very controversial in today's world. And the reason because of this is because Twitch, for instance, hurts that type of linear storytelling. Is because people watch other people just play the game, and then they decide, oh, I don't want to spend this, or that's how they experience it. I do not recommend that's how you experience any type of storytelling game. I recommend that you sit down and you play the game yourself. God of War, for instance, is fantastic, and it has a great story experience, and it really hits hard. But I'm gonna move on to also just talk about getting into it. Is that typing the story, making the story? There are tons of people working on this. There are tons of jobs. If you just want to be a writer, if you just want to write your own book, you can go into the video game industry and you can write for storytelling. There's tons of writers for MMOs, to linear stories, just to these short stories that Blizzard makes, or the Dark Soul weapons, for example. I even recommend reading comic books. One of my favorite web mangas, Tower of God, is a great story, and I think that would be, if that was an MMO, that would be great. I recently started playing World of Warcraft with the new expansion, and the story in that is very interesting. WoW, it has, I think, honestly, one of the biggest lore settings in the entire fucking video game industry. That game is just packed with just different stories, different characters. Each one has their own development. Each person has their own quest. Each person has their own traits, and it's just great. Reading, I think Japanese mangas, I read a lot of Japanese manga. They're experts at this. For instance, Tokyo Ghouls just ended. Tokyo Ghouls was, again, I would say one of those complex kind of Kojima stories where you just want to know what happens next because it's so crazy. I had to read through Tokyo Ghouls twice just to kind of, understand and live in the mind of the author. One Piece is the best-selling manga of all time. It's still going and it's still going strong because they're telling a great story. And even though, it has its ups and downs, as many stories do, there's going to be good parts and there's going to be bad parts. It's amazing. But even old storytelling, mostly now games, you don't have to do a lot of reading in games. Voice acting has come a long way. But if you do decide to, read it through an old game, I highly recommend Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is arguably one of the best games I played this year. Yes, it came out years ago, before I was even born, but it is one of the best games that came out this year, and I highly enjoyed it, and you can see just how much of an impact that game's story has had on so many other games, especially in Square Enix and how they write their stories with the Final Fantasy characters appearing in many other Final Fantasy games and being referenced in Kingdom Hearts. They actually are in Kingdom Hearts. That's the same go for Blizzard with WoW. A lot of the current WoW games come from are inspired by, not WoW. A lot of the current Blizzard games are inspired by World of Warcraft lore. Hearthstone, for instance, is a card game built around World of Warcraft, and I didn't really know that until, I started playing WoW, and I understand, oh, well, that's where that Merfolk song comes from. Oh, Jane is an actual character in the World of Warcraft universe. There's an item called Hearthstone in WoW, and I'm like, oh, so that's how they named the game. You can even see that in uh, Overwatch as well, and they wear it proud because they know that they've written great stories. Same in the movie industry. Nowadays in the movie industry, we don't think about story, to be honest. It's all about superheroes and how much visual acting, CGI, and how much can we pull from that. Uh, if you sit from a very critical point of view, and Avengers Infinity War, for instance, was not a good story. It had a lot of plot holes. It was, didn't make sense. The snap the fingers, the two kind of Avenger teams, we knew, and probably the worst part of it all was the beginning and the ending. One, the beginning of the story made us have to know about Thor Ragnarok. That's not a good way to start a story. Generally, you don't want to do that, especially with maybe with books or comic books, but with movies where they take years to make. No, you don't want to do that. I think a good example of actually how doing this is Incredibles, but Incredibles 1 or Incredibles 2 actually picked off exactly where Incredibles 1 ended, but it didn't, didn't make me have to go rewatch Incredibles 1 to understand where Incredibles 2 started. That's a good way of starting it. Avengers Infinity War, no. The second part is that we know the ending. You should never know the ending of a good story. Yes, you can be able to predict what is happening next, but you shouldn't know how it ends. We know how it ends because we knew this was going to be a two-parter. Spider-Man died in that movie, and they already announced Spider-Man 2, the movie, so it's like, doesn't really hold a whole lot of weight on the audience. And that's why, movie storytelling just isn't as good as it is that it's not relatable. It's just something you watch and you forget. The God of War story, I will not forget. A lot of the manga I read, One Piece, Tokyo Ghouls, I won't forget because there's experiences and the characters are interesting and they grow and they cover all bases. Star Wars is probably the prime best example of storytelling. It's the classic story of a hero's journey, and it's the classic formula. It's perfected, and we just follow it, and people loved it, and you become attached. Same with The Godfather, which is a different type of storytelling, but it's still, that movie, even though it's a mafia movie, is primarily 3 hours, most of those movies are, of just good, solid storytelling. And I actually got this from my father, but there's a version of The Godfather where they put it in chronological order, where you get to see through all uh, three characters' stories, where you get to see from the first Godfather to his son to kind of his son and how he ends, and you get to watch that all in chronological order, and it's perfected way of storytelling. That's why it's made one of the best movies of all time. Citizen Kane, if you've ever watched Citizen Kane, which has been a long time since I have, is again, it's a very old-timey film, and, it maybe, no one of our day of age would probably want to watch it since it's black and white, but it has aged well because it has a good story. However, there are many different ways of also telling a story. Not just through words, like we've kind of been expressing, but just visually as well. If you watch silent films, for instance, those are a perfect example of just visual stories. I often do a lot of art where it's just last week's episode was concept art. Those are stories. And my favorite, honestly, my favorite type of story to uh, be a part of is people's own stories, which I imagine is where a lot of these writers can write their own story without other people changing it, without other people influencing it, where where Kojima is actually the Solid Snake, and that's him picturing himself as Snake, or Superman's creator picturing himself as Superman, or Batman's creator picturing himself as Batman, or you picturing yourself as whatever persona you want to create. Those are honestly my favorite parts of storytelling, and I think those are what makes the best story and the most relatable story. George Lucas is, I think, the perfect example of this, where his persona is Luke Skywalker. George Lucas, Luke Skywalker. That's his story. That's how he wanted it to be told. That's how it was told. And he had other people help him along the way. Other people grow those stories. And now, honestly, the Star Wars Wiki is a story in itself. It's filled with so many different things because the world is so big. And they created their own language. Same with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I think that's his story. And that's the best way to make a story. That's the best way to write a story. And I wish a lot of more people would start writing stories that way. Even if they're on a team, they can all sit down and say, what story do you want to tell, and how can we tell it collectively together? This is Taban Lewis, better known as Salty Waffles, signing off. Make sure to follow the stream. Links in the description. Also visit the website. We're on SoundCloud now. We're also on Google Play. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of It's Not a Sport. Follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube, our Instagram, etc., all that social media. And tune in next week for another great episode of It's Not a Sport. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.